humanists of our time. The modern, unbelieving secularists and humanists of our time. They believe that Christianity is the great danger to freedom and good government.
People who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God.
Welcome to Freethinking 101, brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. This is a course unlike any you have ever had before. We challenge you to examine your beliefs, your values, your mindset, your prejudice, your religion, your philosophy, to look into the corners of your mind and examine the cobwebs that you find there. Today our guest is Steve Best of the Rationalist Society. Steve, I understand you have some articles from Skeptical Inquirer tonight on critical thinking.
Yes, critical thinking is one thing I've been quite interested in as a rationalist. And this is the magazine from which I'm reviewing a couple of articles. The Skeptical Inquirer is put out by the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. It's an organization that is interested in checking out claims that are made in the areas of pseudoscience and so on, and also an organization that's interested in promoting good science. And in this respect, why critical thinking is important.
Well, Steve, it's something I've been hearing quite a bit about lately in relation to the schools and the way Americans think, that we're coming up very short in the area of critical thinking. Why do you think this is happening? What's behind this?
Well, let me tell you what Professor Lett has to say in this area. He has written the article, A Field Guide to Critical Thinking. James Lett is an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Social Sciences at Indian River Community College in Florida. Dr. Lett starts off by observing that there are many reasons for the popularity of paranormal beliefs. These are, things like ESP and astrology, things of that sort. Popularity in the United States. And some of these reasons are the irresponsibility of the mass media, excepting this station, of course.
Of course.
Who exploit the public taste for nonsense, literally nonsense. Secondly, the irrationality of the American worldview, which supports such unsupportable claims as life after death, the efficacy of the polygraph, and many other things. And thirdly, the ineffectiveness of public education, which generally fails to teach students the essential skills of critical thinking. At most, the students have been taught in high school what to think, but not how to think.
Not how to think.
And that's the important
You've heard
thing.
quite a bit about that lately. Do you have some material there on what he means by how to
Let me
think?
get into some of that.
Okay, sure.
To remedy this problem at his college, Dr. Lett has developed an elective course called Anthropology and the Paranormal. The course examines the complete range of paranormal beliefs in contemporary American culture. That's how it fits in with anthropology. From precognition and psychokinesis to channeling and cryptozoology, and everything between and beyond, including astrology, UFOs, and creationism. So he really covers the waterfront, I think.
Oh, all this new age, you're seeing quite a bit of that anymore,
Right.
more all the time.
He gives the students 6 simple rules to follow when considering any claim, and then shows them how to apply those 6 rules to the examination of any paranormal claim. He has an acronym for these 6 rules in the word filters. And I made a little visual aid thing here. If one of the cameras can zero in on this. Ignoring the vowels in this word, the letters in the word filters stand for the rules of falsifiability, logic, comprehensiveness, honesty, replicability. You'll notice I left the P out of that, and that's a good example of what I'm talking about. Someone else read the word and they didn't make any sense out of it. So they, in essence, replicated reading it. When I read it, I didn't notice that I left it out, but I was corrected by someone. And that's what replicability is about. And finally, sufficiency. Dr. Lett suggests applying these 6 rules to the evidence offered for any claim. I'll put this right here.
Okay, I assume you're going to go into a great deal more depth on each one of those,
Right.
and explain what they mean and give some examples.
Yeah.
Falsifiability, what does that mean? How is that
Okay.
related to critical thinking?
It must be possible to conceive of evidence that would prove the claim false. Any claim that could not be falsified would be devoid of any propositional content. In other words, it would be meaningless. That is, it would not be making a factual assertion. It would instead be making an emotive statement, a declaration of the way the claimant feels about the world.
Okay.
And there are two principal ways in which the rule of falsifiability can be violated. First is the undeclared claim, which would be a statement so broad or vague that it lacks any propositional content. Dr. Lett gave some examples. Here's one. The claim that crystal therapists, you know, these little crystals that grow and so on, crystal therapists can use pieces of quartz to restore balance and harmony to a person's spiritual energy. Now, what have I said? What does it mean to have unbalanced spiritual energy?
Exactly.
How is...
If you set up your little shop and
Yeah.
I come in as a, quote, patient, what do you do to me to see if my spiritual energy is unbalanced?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay.
How is the condition recognized and diagnosed? What evidence would prove that someone's unbalanced spiritual energy had been or had not been balanced by the application of crystal therapy? You see, there are a lot of vague things in there that you really can't put your finger on. Another example popular among paranormalists who claim precognitive powers is exemplified by Jean Dixon. I think everybody knows Jean Dixon. For example, 1987 would be a year, quote, filled with changes, unquote, for Carolyn Kennedy. Another, Jack Kemp would, quote, face major disagreements with the rest of his party, unquote, in 1987, and that, quote, worldwide drug terror, unquote, would be, again not quoting, unleashed by narcotics czars, unquote,
Well, those
in
are
the
all-
same year.
yeah, those are all so broad that there's no way that they could not happen.
That's right. I
Steve-
can predict that well myself.
I can too.
Yeah.
Why aren't we on the National Enquirer with our predictions?
That's right. The undeclared claim boils down to whatever will be, que sera, sera.
Right.
The second variety of non-falsifiable statements violation is even more popular and involves the multiple out and inexhaustible series of excuses intended to explain away the evidence that would seem to falsify the claim. And he gives an example of the creationists. They claim that the universe is no more than 10,000 years old. They do so despite the fact that we can observe stars that are billions of light years from Earth, which means that the light must have left those stars billions of years ago. And that proves that the universe must be billions of years old. The creationist response is that God must have created the light already on the way from these distant stars at the moment of creation. Well, how can you answer arguments like that? Anyway, these ways violate the non-falsifiable.
I'm still a little bit unclear on what falsifiability is. Suppose I make a statement. How would you falsify a statement?
Well, let's see.
Suppose I said that man's lifespan is 200 years. How could you falsify
Or that man could live to be, the usual statement is that no man can live to be 200.
No man can live to be 200.
Okay, now that is falsifiable if you find one person that's over 200.
Okay.
So
or
it potentially
you
can be...
imagine
Right.
evidence that would prove it wrong.
That's correct. You can
Okay,
think
now
of
I
something that could
understand.
prove it wrong.
Okay.
But in these other things, you know, you prove them wrong and they make excuses, or they have something that's obvious and you know, just doesn't make sense.
Like the fact that we can find fossils
Right.
that, from millions of years ago. They say, well, God put them in there just to fool us into
Yeah.
thinking.
That's right. That's one of the statements that creationists do to test their faith.
Oh, of course,
Right.
Of course.
The second area is in the area of logic. Any argument offered as evidence in support of any claim must be sound. That is, an argument is said to be valid if its conclusions follow unavoidably from its premises.
Okay.
And he used some elements of logic, you know, some examples of logic in doing simple examples. Now, that's for validity. The argument is sound if it is not only valid, but if the premises are all true.
Okay.
If you don't have both of those things, then you don't have a logical statement. Dr. Lett, as I say, gave some examples of these, and this is one thing that has to be in your critical thinking. Comprehensiveness. The evidence offered in support of any claim must be exhaustive. That is, all of the available evidence must be considered. It is a rule frequently broken by proponents of paranormal claims and by those who adhere to paranormal beliefs. Again, he uses Jean Dixon. I guess she was his main whipping girl, I guess you'd say. Jean Dixon successfully predicted the 1988 election of George Bush 2 months before the election. Really a great prediction.
That's a great prediction.
Yeah. Every social scientist, media person, and private citizen in the country was doing the same thing. As proof of her, she thinks of this as proof of her prognostic abilities. But her followers typically ignore the thousands of forecasts she has made that have failed to come true. And some examples that John F. Kennedy would not win the presidency in 1960, that World War III would begin in 1958, and that Fidel Castro would die in 1969. Her batting average is very poor. Reminds me of a Bob and Ray program on the radio a number of years ago that I was fortunate to hear. They were doing some predicting, and one of them said, "I predict that Lincoln will be assassinated in the Ford Theater." And someone responded, "But that's already happened." And he said, "Yeah, that helps my percentage." And then he said, "Remember, Bob and Ray's predictions are 100% correct 14% of the time." And I think that's pretty much what's going on here. I don't know if that relates to the next item, but this item is honesty. Maybe there is a relationship. But let me read a little bit from the Skeptical Inquirer in this area. It's very cogent. The evidence offered in support of any claim must be evaluated without self-deception. That's honesty. The rule of honesty is a corollary to the rule of comprehensiveness. When you have examined all of the evidence, it is essential that you be honest with yourself about the results of that examination. If the weight of the evidence contradicts the claim, then you are required to abandon belief in that claim.
Sometimes it's very hard to do.
Yeah. For example, I often tell a person, because I'm a rationalist, I'm willing to examine my beliefs. Are you willing to examine your beliefs? Many people are unwilling to examine beliefs like religious beliefs, for example. They're unwilling to examine those beliefs. They accept them unquestioningly. The rule of honesty, like the rule of comprehensiveness, is frequently violated by both proponents and adherents of paranormal beliefs. Parapsychologists violate this rule when they conclude, after numerous subsequent experiments have failed to replicate initially positive psi results, that psi must be an elusive phenomenon. Believers in the paranormal violate this rule when they conclude, after observing a psychic surreptitiously bend a spoon with his hands, that he only cheats sometimes. The rule of honesty means that you must accept the obligation to come to a rational conclusion once you have examined all the evidence. If the overwhelming weight of all the evidence falsifies your belief, then you must conclude that the belief is false, and you must face the implications of that conclusion forthrightly. Denial, avoidance, rationalization, and all the other familiar mechanisms of self-deception would constitute violations of the rule of honesty. And that certainly is true. Replicability, the word that I misspelled on my card. If the evidence for any claim is based upon an experimental result, or if the evidence offered in support of any claim could logically be explained as coincidental, then it is necessary for the evidence to be repeated in subsequent experiments or trials. This provides a safeguard against the possibility of error, fraud, or coincidence. A single experimental result is never adequate in itself, whether the experiment concerns the production of nuclear fusion or the existence of telepathic ability. The rules of replicability The rule of replicability is regularly violated by parapsychologists who are especially fond of misinterpreting coincidences and ignoring the cases that don't pan out. Now, I think our last one is sufficiency. The evidence offered in support of any claim must be adequate to establish the truth of that claim, with these stipulations. One, the burden of proof for any claim rests on the claimant, not on the person that, wants to know if it's true or not. Second, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. This is one of my favorites. Third, evidence based upon authority and or testimony is always, and this is underlined, inadequate for any, that's underlined, paranormal claim. Examples of the requirements include, for the burden of proof, let's look at a couple examples. Let's say I make the statement that last Tuesday it rained for about 10 minutes as I was on the way to work. Now, would you question that? You'd probably accept that.
I would accept that, yes.
Okay. Actually, this is the extraordinary claim when I'm jumping here. That you wouldn't question. If I said I was abducted by extraterrestrial aliens who whisked me to the other side of the moon and performed bizarre medical experiments on me, would you accept that?
No, I'd question that. I'm skeptical enough to question that.
You would like some evidence?
I'd like you to show me the scars and
right.
some photographs that you took while you were there. Of course, those could be faked. I might suspect those. I would have a very hard time believing that.
Okay. Well, you see the difference. The first claim that it was raining, that's commonplace, that's acceptable. But the claim for a much more extraordinary claim really does require extraordinary evidence. The first part was the burden of proof for any claim resting on the claimant. And the example he used was the idea that Hitler is living and healthy in Argentina. You may have heard that before.
Yeah, I've heard that.
At any rate, is it necessary that I prove that he's not living in Argentina? Now, that would take a lot of proving.
Well,
I'd
that
have
would
to
be-
visit every nook and...
everybody in Argentina.
Yeah, I'd have to look at every nook and cranny in Argentina to prove that that's not true. So really, the burden of proof is on the person that makes the claim. He has to prove that
He has
Hitler
to
is
tell
alive
you-
and well in
Give
Argentina.
you some solid evidence that this is true.
That's correct.
And not just that, well, my brother saw him, because that's the testimony thing, and his brother could very well be mistaken.
That's true.
Or lying.
Yeah. The last of these three little elements here, evidence based upon authority and or testimony is always inadequate for any paranormal claim. Authority can often be mistaken. You know, there have been people that have been very authoritative and very wrong in some things. Persons may lie about something, and no amount of expertise is infallible. This is not sufficient evidence, and confirmation is needed. So that's a case where you need to replicate what someone else has said before it's believable. The first three rules of filters, this long, strange word that I have, you skip the vowels, and the first three, falsifiability, logic, and comprehensiveness, are all logically necessary aspects. The last three, honesty, replicability, and sufficiency, are all pragmatically necessary rules of evidential reasoning. So you have three logical ones and three pragmatic ones.
Okay.
What Dr. Lett tells his students is that you can and should use filters. If the claim fails any one of the 6 tests, then it should be rejected. All 6 of them. If it passes all 6 tests, you are justified in placing considerable confidence in it. That is basically the message of Mr. Lett. We have more time to go ahead.
Well, yeah, we can go on a little bit. I was going to get
Go
into
ahead.
the area in our lives where we might be deceived by advertising. Besides these paranormal claims, I mean, it's widely used, especially in propaganda and advertising and those areas.
Let me ask our members of the audience. When you watch television commercials and you hear these glowing things said about products, do you believe that? What do you think? Do you think they're lying to you or exaggerating at least? Are you skeptical of what you see on the tube? Well, if you're skeptical, you're just like, I think, just about everybody else. Nobody believes much of what the advertisers say. So there, in your common day experience, why people are skeptical. Now, it may be that much of the advertising is okay, and maybe they aren't lying, but people wonder.
Well, it's hardly possible for all headache remedies to be
The best. Right.
Or all cough syrups to be the best.
Right.
They all
Presumably
make
some are
claims
better than others.
that would rule out the others, and then the
Yeah.
others make contradictory claims.
Yeah. Speaking of everyday life, there are things you'll run into. There are fortune tellers, astrologers. There's the Missouri Association for Creationism that sponsors the idea that the Earth is no more than 10,000 years old. That's in St. Louis. And you may encounter some of these things. These give you some rules as to how you can look at their claims and see if they hold together. And you'll find many of these kinds of things do not. These New Age phenomena, some of these religious beliefs really have not been tested, or if they are tested, they are found to fail. So you do run into these things in everyday life. Let me just quickly, I suspect we don't have too much more time, but tell you about the second article. This is an article entitled Cold Fusion, A Case History in Wishful Science, written by Milton Rothman, a retired physicist. And this occurred early last year, and you may remember reading about it in the newspapers and the magazines like Time. two chemists, Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann from the University of Utah, claimed they had electrolyzed heavy water, that's deuterium oxide, by passing electric current between a platinum anode and a palladium cathode immersed in the water. The released deuterium concentrated itself inside the solid palladium. When the deuterium was sufficiently concentrated, so the story went, the deuterium nuclei fused together and energy was released. Now, how they knew this was a measurement of more thermal energy coming out of the device than was put in by the electric current. Milton Rothman was a physicist working in the area of fusion, but he was using machines that cost millions of dollars and real complicated equipment and working at extremely high temperatures and so on. So this idea of cold fusion really floored him, you know. Could somebody in just a little laboratory, not spending much money, come up with something that would really provide fusion? If so, why, this is the salvation of the world as far as energy is concerned. Another scientist, Stephen Jones, had been working on cold fusion for 2 years. He didn't get any heat out of his experiments, but he did get a small amount of neutrons that were a product of what he was working on. And he suggested that he and Pons and Fleischmann pool their efforts. Well, this was somewhat rejected, but finally Pons and Fleischmann agreed that they would submit their work at the same time that he submitted his to the British magazine Nature. And the day before they were to do that, Pons and Fleischmann held a press conference at which they announced their findings. A press conference. Now, that's not the way you do it in science. You send your material to a journal that juries it and makes you make some changes and so on before it's acceptable, and then they publish it, and then other people can look at what you've done and they can replicate it or not, as the case may be. Anyway, many labs sought to replicate the Pons-Fleischmann findings, but they were handicapped as there was no clear description of how they did it. And some labs found some heat, some found some neutrons, but later, much more careful studies found neither. And it turns out some of the earlier findings used faulty procedures or faulty equipment. So it's really in the dustbin now of scientific accomplishments. And Rothman came up with several rules to observe in a cold fusion case. Don't believe everything you read or hear. Cast a cold eye on studies and experiments from which different workers elicit different answers. If a claim is made for a phenomenon that violates one or more of the laws of nature, be doubly cautious. Fourth, be skeptical of the opinions of experts outside their areas of expertise. Pons and Fleischmann were chemists, not physicists, and fusion experiments were more properly in the area of the expertise of the physicist. The last one was be wary of scientists and economists and theologians, etc., who fall madly in love with their own theories. These are people who, you know, if it's disproved, they still hang in there even though it's disproved.
Like creationists.
Yeah, that's right. Now this is, of course, the cold fusion is an example of the problem science has when people are ignoring these 6 rules that James Lett had put out. But in science, of course, they can catch up on that. And the person can't get away with a thing because the scientists will find it out. And that's the interesting thing about science. They apply these rules, and a person can't get by with something that, you know, doesn't hold water. And it's a sort of a self-correcting process.
Okay, in the little bit of time that we have left, Steve, it looks like you've come up with a good definition of a skeptic. Can you say just a word of define a skeptic and tell us why it's important to be one?
Okay. I consider myself to be a skeptic. A skeptic is a person who doesn't accept just the word of anyone, At least he applies certain rules of probability on something. If someone tells me it rained yesterday, I won't question that. But again, that example of they've been to the moon with aliens, I would question that. A person, if someone makes a statement that's, you know, sort of, you have to stretch your beliefs to believe it, then you may want to investigate it. And certainly I like to do that.
I think we're out of time here.
Okay.
We'd like to thank you for being here, and we'd like to ask our viewers to write to us at the Rationalist Society of St. Louis, Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri, 63130.
I enjoyed being here.
Well, I've got